What if you found yourself in a train to hell, and you didn't even know it? There's a metallic shift between his feet, and the train shifts slightly, as if it had passed over the switching point. Andrew Smith looks up from his phone, his mind briefly mulling over the fact that he wasn't aware of a switching point on this train route. A vague memory of the train map moving quickly throughout his mind. He glances down at his phone, frowning, as he sees that he has completely lost signal, and he lets out a sigh, aware that his night has just gotten exceptionally longer without the mind-numbing distraction that staring at his phone would provide. He wasn't a train person, so this was definitely his last option. It didn't help that the train's route took him dangerously close to the town of Silverton. He wasn't normally a superstitious man, but he had heard stories about that place. Stories that gave him shivers. He didn't want to go near it if he didn't have to. Being a state cop brought him all over the place, but he had luckily only been as close to the town over from Silverton, and that was close enough for him. The train shifts again, and Andrew looks out the window by his seat. The world beyond was merely a swirling dark void that rushed past in the night. He could see the outline of the trees, he could see hills in the distance, but nothing that would tell him where he was. He turned back to his train car. Only 2 other people were in this particular car, and both had gotten onto the train with him. One was a squat man, who looked like he had a couple layers of fat over what was once a muscular body. His nose was crooked, looking like it had taken a couple of punches throughout his life, and he watched the world through beady eyes. He caught Andrew looking at him, and he stared back for a hard second. Andrew nodded to break the tension, and the man went back to staring out the window. The second man was wildly unassuming, thick glasses separating him from the world, and his hair was a mop that sat atop his head with absolutely no effort put into it. He wore a simple button-up shirt and a tie, khakis and loafers. The train shifted again, and Andrew decided to stand, stretching his legs. The stretch feels good, but the relaxing moment doesn't last long, as a sharp report of gunfire in the next car causes him to turn his head sharply. "What the hell was that?" Cubicle asks, fear creeping into his voice as he looks up from his seat with concern on his face. Stocky doesn't say anything, his lack of facial expression showing that he's not new to gunfire. Andrew motions with his hand for them to remain seated as he begins to move through the next car. "I'm gonna check it out. I suggest you 2 stay in your seats," he tells them as he heads for the door, quickly moving, opening the sliding door and heading into the next car. He glances out the window quickly, and as his head snaps back, he swears that he sees a human shape passing by. But when he looks back, he only sees his own reflection in the glass. He opens the door next to the car and is hit by a wave of fog as he steps into it. The strange cloud of moisture is almost a living thing as it begins to swirl around him. He looks up to see that this car is slightly more full than his own, with several windows cracked open, random heads poking up from where people cower in their seats, hiding from a man on the far end. He looks up at Andrew, waving the gun around that he clutches in his hand wildly. Andrew puts up his hands, but the man's eyes have already seemed to unfocus on him, as if he's of no concern, the fog swirling around him as he waves the gun. "You all died! I saw it with my own eyes!" he shouts wildly, so Andrew steps forward, still keeping his hands where the man could see them. Though every time his eyes shift, it seems as if he's looking at something that Andrew is unable to perceive. He motions for the passengers to stay down as he passes by them, whispering to them to remain calm and stay low until he finally stands within 5 feet of the nervous man. "Sir, are you okay?" he asks, trying not to startle the agitated man more than he already has. The man turns, still holding the pistol out in front of him, his eyes finally seeming to focus as he sees Andrew for the first time. "They're here. They've come for me," he gasps, tears beginning to well up in the corner of his eyes, the gun shaking in his hands. "I tried to save them. I tried to go back to them, but I had no choice." The words coming out in choking gasps as Andrew is still holding up his hands, trying to show the man that he is no threat. "I understand, sir, but you're scaring all of these nice people who don't know anything about that," he says as he motions to the cowering passengers, the man's eyes roaming over the car, a look of surprise that he isn't the only one on the train showing on his face. "Why don't you hand me that gun and sit down? I'll make sure that whoever it is doesn't hurt you. I'm a cop." He reaches out his hand as the man begins to nod, sinking back into his seat, and Andrew releases a breath that he didn't know he was holding on to as he finally takes the gun from the man's hands. He checks it quickly, making sure that the safety is on before turning back to the rest of the passengers. He motions that it's okay as they slowly begin to stand back up. The door to the car suddenly slides open to reveal Stocky and Cubicle from his car. "What the hell is going on?" Stocky snaps, practically pushing Cubicle out of the way. They both seem surprised by the swirling fog in the car, which Andrew hadn't realized had only become thicker since he entered. A loud thump suddenly slams onto the roof before he can answer the shouted question, and everyone looks up in shock, some ducking instinctively at the noise. 2 more thumps quickly follow the first. Andrew looks back at his car partners, surprised to see Stocky now holds a pistol in his hand. "Does everyone have a gun today?" He whispers to himself, and to his left, the window suddenly shatters inward. He turns in shock to see a ghostly hand reach in, ripping the nervous man from his seat, a terrified scream escaping his lips as he's yanked out into the night. The fog moves around them, almost a solid, living creature. The people are now up and running towards Andrew. The previous fear of a gun-wielding maniac gone, replaced by the fear of the unknown. His training takes over as he quickly moves towards the door to the next car, sliding it open and motioning everyone through. Passengers rushing past him, their eyes wide with fear. The last through were Stocky and Cubicle, with Stocky eyeing him as Andrew's eyes drop to the pistol that he held in his hand. "Do you always travel with a firearm?" he asks quickly. Stocky grunts a reply to him and he slips through the door. Andrew pauses for a moment, looking back at the fog that has engulfed the train car. For a moment it looked as if there were dark shapes moving throughout it, his eyes widening as the fog cloud seems to inhale for a moment before surging towards him. Not waiting to see what would happen when it reached him, he slips through the door and it slams shut behind him. He turns quickly to move into the next car, but is stopped short when he realizes that Stocky and Cubicle haven't moved forward. "What the hell?" he snaps, but Stocky holds up his hands, motioning Andrew to be quiet, pointing in front of them. "Something's moving," he whispers. Andrew looks forward, seeing that this car was even more fog-filled than the last. It was thick, obscuring their view past a few feet. It swirls around the seats as Andrew swore that he saw something moving into the pale clouds. The sound of breaking glass reaches them, and then the car is filled with a cacophony of screaming. The sound of running footsteps stomping towards them on the carpeted floor. Andrew pushes forward, shoving Cubicle behind him as both he and Stocky raise their pistols. A woman then comes rushing out of the fog, a look of fear crossing her face. Andrew lowered his weapon, reaching a hand out for her, but shock widened her eyes as something grabbed her from behind. A piercing scream escapes her lips as she was yanked backwards, but was cut off as the fog enveloped her. Stocky raises his weapon, firing twice into the swirling mist. Andrew twists his head away as the explosion fills his ears. He reaches out a hand, pushing Stocky's pistol downward. "What are you doing?" he shouts. "You might hit someone!" Stocky glares at him, pulling his weapon free of Andrew's hands. "That's what I was trying to do!" he snaps, motioning towards the fog before them. It slowly creeps up even closer. "There's something in there! Something that's grabbing people, and I ain't gonna let it get me!" he growls. "And who put you in charge anyways?" he asks, with Andrew pulling his badge out of his pocket. "I'm a cop, asshole!" He tries to brush away Cubicle, who's pulling at his sleeve, but the man persists. Andrew turns to see him frighteningly pointing back to the doors that they just came through. What's there?" he stammers, and Andrew turns to see a massive, dark shape moving through the fog, slowly coming towards the windowed door. He looked at Stocky for a moment before they both nodded. "You move forward. Only shoot at what you can see. Don't fire wildly," he snaps, and then he turns to Cubicle. "Sir, I need you to move between us. I'll bring up the rear and I'll protect you," he tells him, but the man is still staring at the dark shape lumbering throughout the fog. It's almost at the door now. "Sir!" Andrew snaps, trying to bring the man back to the situation. He begins to blink, as if remembering that there are others around him. Michael, my name is Michael Cockner," he stammers out, and Andrew nods, trying to put a soothing tone to his voice. "Michael, I need you to move between myself and..." He begins, glancing at the Stocky man. "Steve Plummer," he grunts, obviously ready to move. "Myself and Plummer will do our best to protect you," he says, with Michael finally nodding his head dumbly. And Andrew motions for Plummer to get moving. The dark shape is almost at the door, the 3 men beginning to move forward quickly. Dark shapes still moving throughout the fog, and Andrew tries to avoid letting them touch him. Another scream issues from somewhere ahead, giving Plummer pause. But it lasts only a beat, and the man is moving again, his pistol pushing forward, attempting to ward off whatever evil might be before them. Andrew catches a brief glimpse of someone else in the fog, screaming for help, but the man is yanked away before they can manage to get to him. Plummer fires 2 more shots, hoping to ward off whatever is coming at them. Andrew glances back, but the door has long since been swallowed up by the pale clouds around them. He turns back sharply as Michael screams in fear, the man lurching back as he clutches at his arm with deep scratches tearing across it. He stumbles over the seats to the left. Andrew looks down, his eyes widening in shock as he sees a hand reaching from the swirling fog, Cockner's blood dripping from its fingernails. He puts an arm up to try and protect the weak man while he aims the pistol to where he would assume the arm would be connected. He fires twice into the fog, but it's become so thick that he can't even see the windows that should only be a few feet in front of them. While he doesn't hear any sounds of pain, the hand is quickly withdrawn and it disappears. He grabs for Cockner, forcing him to his feet, pushing him forward again. The man is stumbling, now still clutching at his wounded arm. "Door!" Plummer finally shouts as they reach the end of the train. A trip that took less than a minute felt like hours, and he moves fast, grabbing the sliding door, opening it up. He allows the 3 men to rush into the next car. It's almost as if they had awakened from a bad dream as they find this car brightly lit, no fog waiting for them. Andrew steps into what he assumed is the diner car. He finds a man dressed in a turn-of-the-century conductor's uniform waiting for them. "Tickets, please," he says with a wide smile, holding out a white-gloved hand. Andrew doesn't know what to say at first, shaking his head in a kind of shock. His mouth opening up in response, but no words coming out. It's Plummer that speaks, shoving past Andrew, moving towards the conductor aggressively. "Tickets! Do you have any idea what is going on back there?" he demands. The conductor's smile never wavers as his eyes flick to the red, angry face of Plummer. "I have some idea, yes," he says simply. Plummer is shocked by the man's attitude, the lack of fear in his eyes, not allowing him anywhere to put his anger. Andrew steps forward, placing a hand on his shoulder, pulling him back. "We already had our tickets punched when we boarded the train," he explains. The conductor purses his lips and puts them together, shaking his head. "That was a different ride, I'm afraid," he says, as if this explained everything to them. He looked at their confused faces and finally sighed. "The matter of fact is, with your new destination in mind, you'll all require a ticket." He looks at each of them for a moment. "I can see that some of you have tickets, while others have found themselves on this train strictly by accident, which is a very unfortunate set of circumstances, I'm afraid." He reaches into his coat pocket, pulling out a shiny pocket watch, clicking it open, tutting once more as he looks at the time. "We'll be arriving at our destination soon, which means that your tickets will have to be punched before then. We can't have anyone riding this train without a ticket," he says as he glances back at them, his smile never wavering. Andrew looks back at his 2 companions, still not sure what is going on. Plummer just shrugs angrily, his finger tightening on the grip of his pistol. "All right," Andrew says as he begins to turn back to the conductor. "So if you can't have someone riding this train who doesn't have a ticket, and someone in our group doesn't have a ticket, maybe you should stop the train and let us off," he suggests, picking his words carefully as to never take his eyes off of the strange man. The conductor closes his watch, putting it back in his pocket and looking up at the ceiling as if thinking on the suggestion. "I do suppose that is possible, though it wouldn't be up to me," he says, turning, flourishing his hands towards the next door, at the far end of the dining car. "It's really up to the engineer to decide if the train should be stopped. He's the only one with the power to do so," he says, still smiling as he glances at Andrew, his eyes in a smile, acting as if they've revealed the darkest secrets of the world to the 3 companions. But the looks on their faces show that they are more confused than ever. All 3 men begin to nod as they slowly move past the conductor, trying not to turn their backs to him. Andrew glances back as they near the door, seeing the conductor waving his white-gloved hand. "Just remember, someone's ticket must be punched before the train can reach its destination, or it might never stop," he calls with a smile. The 3 men slide through the next door, finding an empty, first-class car. "What the hell was that?" Plummer asks as he flops down into the seat, the pistol clutched in his hand. Andrew just shakes his head. No idea, but that was pretty creepy, he says softly, and they both turn to Michael, who is staring out the window, his lips moving slightly, as if slightly muttering to himself. Plummer gets up, moving away from the disturbed man. You all right, Michael? Andrew asks, reaching out a hand for the man to try and snap him back to their situation. Michael jumps as Andrew's hand touches his shoulder, as if he forgot that they were there. He reached for me, he whispers, tears beginning to fill the corners of his eyes. He reached for me and told me that I had to go, that it was my punishment. He continues, turning away from them, staring back out the window, continuing to mutter, as if telling a story to someone that they can't see. It was a year ago. I was driving home after having a couple of beers after work. I guess I was driving too fast. He looks at them, fear and confusion in his eyes. But I didn't see them. I don't know where he came from. He should have been more careful. He begins to shout, Plummer beginning to raise his pistol and Andrew stepping between them, shaking his head. But Michael has already turned back to the window. I just kept driving. No one saw me. No one ever questioned me. He mutters, and then he turns back to Andrew. But I saw the kid in the fog. He reached for me and he whispered to me, he says quickly, holding up his slashed forearm. His fingers were like knives cutting through me. He gasps before turning back to the window. Andrew raises an eyebrow before backing up a few steps to stand next to Plummer, who begins to speak out of the corner of his mouth, trying not to let Michael hear his words. The guy in the first car, whose gun I took, he was muttering like this too, he explains. Kept going on about how he had to leave them, that he couldn't save them. He continues, and Plummer raises an eye, not taking his eyes off of Cockner. You think the fog is doing something to them? Driving them all to the loony bin? He asks, and Andrew shrugs. No idea, but that wouldn't explain whatever was taking people, or that weird conductor, he says, and Plummer nods. Plus, what was that all about tickets being punched? He asks, not really expecting an answer. Andrew finally reaches forward, taking a hold of Michael's arm once more. Come on, we're gonna go talk to the engineer about getting off this train, he says soothingly, though he seems unhappy about it. Michael allows Andrew to steer him towards the front of the train. The three men reach the far door when the train suddenly lurches, throwing them all off balance. The air is filled with the sound of tearing metal from behind, and they all turn, with Plummer raising his pistol almost immediately. The train lurches again, throwing the three men to the floor, and they all look up in terror as the tearing metal gets louder, and behind them, the train shudders again before the back end is ripped away, allowing the fog to flood into the first-class chamber. The fog isn't the biggest thing that they fear any longer, though, because standing at the end of the car is a massive figure, a bloody bearskin draping over his head, casting his face into the shadows, barbed wire crisscrossed across his bare chest, leading down into a lower body that is draped in bloody robes and dangling chains. He carries in his hand a massive cleaver, which is dragged across the floor. Andrew struggles to his feet as the monster steps forward, the pistol coming up quickly, firing twice. The round impacts the monster's chest, but it doesn't even slow him down. He turns to look at his companions, and he sees that both Plummer and Cockner are merely staring at the monster, transfixed. What the hell are you two doing? He shouts at them, his words seemingly having no effect. It was Plummer that finally seems to shake himself free of the trance first, glancing at Andrew, who could see the fear in his eyes. I understand, he gasps. But Andrew shakes his head, still not understanding what the man means. A ticket needs to be punched, Plummer continues with a nod of his head. He gets to his feet, tucking the pistol within his belt, reaching down, wrapping his arms underneath Cockner's armpits, pulling himself to his feet. The monster has almost reached them now, but it seems to pause briefly. What are you doing? Andrew shouts at Plummer, but the man isn't listening anymore. He begins to push Cockner forward, as if he's finally realized what is happening. And the timid man begins to finally struggle, trying to push against the stocky man that probably outweighs him by 50 pounds. And Plummer gives him one final shove, throwing Michael at the feet of the massive bear man. He then doesn't hesitate, turning, grabbing Andrew by the arm, dragging him towards the doors. Andrew tries to fight, but could do little more than watch as the monster reaches down, wrapping his massive hand around Michael's face, lifting him into the air as if he weighed nothing. Cockner's muffled screams could continue to be heard as both men stepped through the next door, though they were finally cut off as the door closes behind them. The next car is similarly quiet, as if what happened behind them was nothing more than a bad dream. They both stood there for a moment, trying to catch their breath after the terrifying moment that just occurred. But the train suddenly lurches again, and they both quickly realize that they have begun to slow down. Andrew glances at the windows as they begin to move forward, and he can make out the outline of a town passing them, darkness and fog obscuring the finer details. "What the hell was that?" he demands of Plummer, reaching out, trying to grab his arm, but the stocky man shrugs him off and continues forward, not bothering to answer as he nears the front of the train, stepping through the doors. But instead of continuing forward to the next car on this train, he takes a right turn and he steps out the exit. Andrew quickly follows him, not seeing that he has many other options other than to stick with his newfound ally. Both men find themselves on an old-fashioned train platform, something out of the turn of the century. The town that lay before them is shrouded in the same thick fog from the train, though they can see lights in the distance. Andrew turns back to the train, shocked to discover that it hasn't been destroyed. "What the hell is going on?" he whispers, as he turns back to look at Plummer, who is shaking his head. The stocky man is staring into the fog, dark shapes already having begun to swirl through it, moving towards them. Plummer raises his pistol, sweat springing out of his forehead as he raises the weapon. Andrew doesn't know what is going on, doesn't know what to expect. But in the confusion, he sees one simple sign. One sign that pushes his stomach deep down inside of him, and fear finally sets in. "Welcome to Silverton."